In the immortal words of Eminem, nowadays everybody wants to talk like they've got something to say. I'm making this video because I really have something to say. And yeah, I see you out there. I see the other vegans trying to jump on this Kalel Cullen controversy. And maybe you managed to drum up some outrage. Maybe you managed to drum up some, I don't know, random insults, Sturm und Drang. But most of you just have nothing to say. I'm real familiar with these types of situations because before I was ever vegan, I was a Buddhist. I was a member of the Orthodox Theravada Buddhist faith, and we dealt with exactly these issues all the time. And before that, Season 1, Eisel Mazard. Season 0, Eisel Mazard. Eisel Mazard, the prequel, I was a communist, and not by any choice of my own. I was born and raised to be a communist. In 20th century slang, I was what you'd call a red diaper baby, which is to say my parents raised me with the works of Karl Marx, Lenin, and Mao Zedong on the bookshelf. I was taught to be a communist from the cradle to the grave, and instead, I think I was a communist up to about age 15. I wouldn't put a precise year on it, but at some point I started asking tough questions and got my way out of that mix of politics and religion. Okay? Among the things that's most striking to me in this discourse surrounding Kalel and her ongoing rejection of her fellow vegans while claiming to represent the highest principles of what veganism is supposed to stand for, is that so many people, including Kalel herself, say that she has just done so much for the movement. But she's done so much. She's done so much for veganism. She's done so much. And then she's suffered so much. She's suffered the slings and arrows of controversy. She's endured so much. Let's keep it all the way real here, people. Who has done less and who has suffered less? Growing up as a communist, I was inured to the expectation that I, like other rebel leaders, would literally live in a cave with a machine gun at some point in my life. Maybe for years, maybe for decades. The assumption of persecution, civil war, revolution in the proper sense of the word revolution. A lot of people talk about things being revolutionary without really thinking what that word means. The assumption that my life in future as an adult would not be so different from, people in the caves of northern Vietnam and Laos, people who were in fact still fighting at that time in some places like Cambodia, still during my childhood. The Khmer Rouge were still out there, cutting people's heads off, by the way. All that was still going on. The question of what have you done for the movement? What have you endured? What have you suffered? I came into this game as a child or as a young adult with some very different standards and expectations, right? In terms of what you do and what you represent. Then when I was a young man, an adult, but a young man, and I got deeply involved with Buddhism, we dealt with this kind of controversy all the time because vegetarianism, not even veganism, but just vegetarianism has a sort of controversial gray area status within Buddhism. It's definitely not official church doctrine to be vegetarian or vegan. And yet I would have to ask Buddhist monks and Buddhist leaders, because sometimes the leaders are not monks, they're lay people, but who become full-time preachers of Buddhism in the same sense that I'd say someone like Unnatural Vegan is a full-time preacher of veganism. I'd have to ask them, what credibility do you have giving a lecture about the importance of not killing a fly, the importance of not killing cockroaches, when you have literally eaten beef for lunch, and then you're going to go home and eat pork or chicken for dinner afterwards? What is the credibility you have in lecturing on the Buddhist virtues of nonviolence, which of course extend to things like war, but very often do indeed involve tiny life forms that we, if you're a practicing Buddhist, I can remember doing this myself. I'd always keep a ceramic cup that I would use to trap insects without harming them and then put them outside instead of killing them. I can remember when I was doing humanitarian work in northern Laos, one of the greatest struggles when there was an enormous cockroach that got inside my suitcase. So it was in there like hiding with the clothes. And my trying to get this cockroach out of the suitcase without killing it or without harming it. If you take the precepts of Buddhism seriously, then actually living with and around insects is one of your greatest problems in life. But we get into these same questions in veganism, like how can you talk seriously about not killing animals or not eating meat or not buying meat if every day you're buying, dead cows that have been cut up and put into a metal can so that you can feed it to your cat, so that you can feed it to your dog? These are tough questions for everyone. These are glaring contradictions a lot of people live with. But obviously, the question for a Buddhist monk or for a Buddhist leader is different than it is for a private rank-and-file Buddhist. And of course, one of the reasons there is exactly that there's someone preaching these virtues rather than merely imperfectly trying to practice these virtues. And the other reality is just the economics of where their money comes from. Sure, somebody like a natural vegan, I'll come back to Kalel, somebody like a natural vegan, to my knowledge, she pays her rent and she's saving up money to put her kid through college on the basis of donations from other vegans. So why would it be too much to ask for her to strictly and assiduously follow a vegan diet and to, talk in a consistent and coherent way about vegan ethics, to kind of live up to the bare minimum standard of veganism in both principle and practice? Now, within the Buddhist religion, there's actually another really important parallel here about monks living up to the standards they preach, and that is celibacy. Now, obviously, it takes a little bit of imagination to see how this applies to veganism, as opposed to just talking about monks eating cow meat within Buddhism, eating cow meat while preaching that you shouldn't harm a fly. If you really believe in the core philosophy of Buddhism, it's very clear that at least Buddhism 1.0, real Buddhism, historically actual Buddhism, is utterly based on glorifying a life of celibacy. And that this life of celibacy results from a profound realization that, in the words of the canon, the words of the ancient scripture, results in you tearing up desire by its roots. So after you have this realization, you're no longer going to feel this kind of desire. You're no longer going to want to have sex, and then you're going to live in celibacy as a result. How can a Buddhist monk receive donations and, pay for all the things he has in life? And let's face it, in the 21st century, most Buddhist monks do live with the comforts of the modern world. They're not living in a cave. They're not living in a cave like a communist revolutionary. They're also not living in the cave like an ancient monk from 2,500 years ago. They're not living this kind of simple, humble life. There are monks who own cars, have a driver's license. There are monks who have cell phones and computers and all this kind of thing. But how are you going to receive these donations and preach this philosophy when you are yourself seducing and having sex with your followers? When you are seducing and having sex with, let's say, other men's wives, married women? Or, in some ways it's more damaging if you're talking about them seducing and having sex with younger women who've never been married. These are circumstances that in some cases tear Buddhist communities apart. There was one Buddhist monk in Toronto, I am not going to use his name, but he was willing to publicly talk about the way in which his sex life had really interfered with his Buddhist practice. I remember an article written by him, so not accusations against him, where he said in a very down-to-earth way that he was celibate for a certain period of his life. Then he fell in love with one of the women who were one of his followers, a woman he was teaching meditation to. And I believe they got married. And then a couple years later, they got divorced. And then he was unsure if he should just openly date his followers or if he should go back to living in celibacy. And, he talked about kind of his next girlfriend or wife after that and so on. I can remember him. I remember this one particular, and he was an Asian monk. He wasn't a white man, living in Toronto and talking about the ins and outs of this. The problem is not dating itself. The problem is not sex itself. And the problem is not the same if you are a Buddhist monk or if you are just a follower, if you're one of the donors at the church. If you're one of the donors and you happen to meet and date other women who are there as donors, that situation is completely different from being a leader, an authority figure, and someone who is the recipient of those donations. especially in the context where the philosophy you're preaching is exactly one of tearing up desire by its roots and then moving on beyond sexual desire to live in celibacy and attain nirvana and these things. Now, look, I don't know what the future holds for Buddhism. It's very obvious that something like Buddhism 2.0 has got to come up. There's got to be a form of reformed Buddhism that gets rid of some aspects of the religion that don't really work in the 21st century, like the belief in hell, the belief in the afterlife generally, the belief in demons and yetis, magical things. If Buddhism is going to survive into the 22nd century, there are going to have to be changes. And there was a time when I thought I might play my role as that kind of reformer, intellectual leader in Buddhism. At this moment, doesn't seem to be on my list of priorities. There already are terms out there for what Kalel is. And she's preferring to try to change the definition of veganism and, keep her cards close to her chest about what she believes, what she preaches, and what she practices, because she doesn't like any of the other terms that are already out there. What Kalel is a fake vegan. Now, I wish I could follow that up by saying, and that's okay. The problem is precisely that she's someone who put herself in the position of a leader, of a public figure. I can't say if she received donations from this. I think she just makes enough money off of her YouTube channel directly that she doesn't solicit donations for veganism as a cause. But she has very much played the card of presenting herself as a martyr, which is really absurd and grotesque and shameful, especially in the context of this controversy. She herself is saying that she has done so much for veganism, that she has suffered so much for veganism. Now, again, who has suffered less? For any movement that tried to change the world in the history of the world, the leaders of the gay rights movement, African American leaders of the civil rights movement, the movement to abolish slavery, again, communist revolutionaries living in the jungle with their, machine guns, student protesters in Myanmar who wanted to replace a military dictatorship with a democracy. I read the autobiography of one of those guys, and he really did literally live in the jungle with, a machine gun and a machete. Tough life. Who has suffered less? And in Kalel's case, indeed, it deserves to be asked, who has done less? What is it that she imagines she's done for this movement? Looking at her Instagram, I can see she did a photo shoot where she was posing with a chicken. And this is an example of her vegan activism. So she got dressed up in fancy clothes in a corset and had a professional photographer take a picture of her holding a chicken. And she preaches some kind of vegan virtues next to it. Well, how would you feel if this were a Buddhist monk and he were in the same pose or what have you? There are Buddhist monks who have Instagram or other blogs or profiles that put these things. And the Buddhist monk is preaching celibacy. But he's sleeping with his followers. How would you feel if it was a Buddhist monk preaching nonviolence, but that he's eating beef for lunch? How would you feel if that it's a self-appointed leader of the vegan movement? A self-appointed leader who does not have the fortitude or self-discipline to even refuse buying popcorn at a movie theater when she knows that it's covered with butter, to refuse to buy a chocolate bar or a donut that she knows is not vegan. That's the situation that we're in with Kalel, and I don't think this is the last challenge veganism is going to face from within this way. I'd like to follow this up immediately by recording a video where I talk a little bit about the progress of the movement. And in that context, it's always important to point back to what a low point we were at, the nadir of the vegan movement, with a guy named Peter Singer. Peter Singer's not the start of the vegan movement, but he was a major, famous leader for veganism who utterly undermined and contradicted the most basic tenets and principles of veganism. I'll get into that in another video. Now, likewise, you can say Buddhism has had to endure having Buddhist monks who utterly undermine and contradict the most basic principles and tenets of Buddhism. This is a struggle. However, it may be that veganism is going to make progress in this world, it's not going to be by selling out its own tenets, its own principles. It's not going to be by making hypocrites of ourselves that we convince the rest of the world to step up and take on this higher level of moral responsibility. All right, guys, as I say, I come at this from a very different angle from other vegans. There are people who got into veganism in the first place just because they were interested in health, beauty, and weight loss. That's very, very different from approaching this from the perspective of somebody who was raised to be a communist revolutionary. Later in life got very skeptical about what communism was and what that really entailed, but then who came out of that still wanting to make a fundamentally positive difference in the world, still caring about poverty and the plight of the poor and the aftermath and effects of devastating wars that America had engaged in, that other countries had engaged in too, of wanting to make the world a better place, but of knowing how deeply wrong the ultimately violent methods offered by communism were, who then got involved with history and politics of Asia, languages of Asia through Buddhism, and then relatively late in life, after the failure of a number of different attempts at ways of making the world a better place, I'm someone for whom veganism emerged as my primary identity, as my primary form of activism, and it's the form of activism for which I'm now planning to go back to college, get another college degree, devote more of my time. And yet, again, I'm not the one out here saying that I've suffered so much. I don't think I suffer when I refuse to eat popcorn or refuse to eat a chocolate bar. To me, that is absolutely surreal. I'm not even out here saying that I suffer when other vegans threatened to murder me, explicitly murder me, in other threats, have me beaten up in the streets, dragged to the police station, face false charges. I have, in this sense, stood up to persecution of a much more literal and direct kind. And not persecution from the meat industry, not persecution from dairy farmers. Other vegans, rival vegan activists, rival vegan leaders in the vegan movement did this to me, right? And all I've got to say is, from my perspective, coming from my background, who has suffered less? Kalel, I'd love to say that you have a lot to offer veganism in the future, but I'd be lying to you if I said that. Kalel, I'd love to say to you that I don't judge you by your past actions and your past mistakes, and that I instead judge you by your future potential to do good, to do something positive for the movement. But here's the reality. Kalel Cullen, her nickname on the internet, Kalel Kitten, is somebody who puts absolutely all of her time, effort, and energy into her physical appearance and the beauty of the interior decor of her apartment so that she can marry a rich man. She slept her way into YouTube. She slept her way into fame, and she is planning to sleep her way out of YouTube. She has repeatedly slowed down or stopped making YouTube videos because she thought she finally found a man who had those properties, a man she could marry, who would then take care of her. And she's repeatedly lost those relationships, broken off those engagements for marriage, etc. So everyone knows this. She stopped making YouTube videos because she found some guy who was allegedly going to marry her, buy her a house, etc. If this were true of myself as a man, let's just step back and look at this in terms of gender equality. If I were a man who devoted all of my time to my physical appearance through exercise, diet, and plastic surgery, because, oh yes, I believe Kalel Cullen, by her own count, has had more than 8 plastic surgery procedures before she's turned 30. By age 29, she's had many, many plastic surgery procedures. If I devoted all of my time and energy to my physical appearance, exercise, diet, plastic surgery, makeup, hair, and the affectations of outward beauty involving designer purses, designer shoes, the interior decoration of my apartment, and makeup. And if I did all this as a man, with the explicit purpose of one day seducing and settling down with a woman who was wealthy enough to take care of me. What would your opinion be of me as a man? How would you judge me in those circumstances? And how would you judge me as a potential political leader for the vegan movement or for any movement? I think the judgment would be incredibly harsh. And we haven't yet reached the point in terms of the sophistication of our cultural response to gender inequality where it even occurs to us to look at Kalel Cullen, Kalel Kitten, and judge her by the same standard in the same way. All right, guys. I had something to say, and now I am out.